hello everyone who's listening. So the idea of this webinar is just to really introduce some of the issues around how electric vehicles affect power systems, electricity supply. From that point, my background, it's worth mentioning, I've got 25 years as an industry and business analyst. I've been independent for the last 15 years and I do associate training for Green Power Academy, hence doing this webinar and with a course coming up. My focus these days is not on vehicles per se, it's on business analysis, education and market briefings within power systems, so clean energy, system flexibility, storage and so on. And obviously part of the impact on power systems that's certainly going to be important going forwards is electric vehicles. How can we charge them? What effect will it have on the system and so on? So that's what I want to briefly introduce here. I'm approaching EVs not from the car perspective so much as from the power system perspective. Anyway, if you want to find more about my background, you can find me on LinkedIn there. Okay, so going straight into it. There are three key issues which I wanted to briefly introduce, and they all arrive really at one related conclusion, which is that we're not going to have a mass market of electric vehicles unless we can manage the charging of those vehicles. So this idea that we can have every car in the UK suddenly go electric and people can just kind of plug in exactly when they want doesn't stack up. So we'll talk about why that is. I split it down into three issues, which is ones that people often raise. One is, how much electricity do we need? Do we need to build a gazillion new power stations to do this? Another one is going to be, what about locally? There are local constraints. People may have heard about issues around distribution systems and local capacity and so on. So we'll briefly introduce that as well. And then obviously the other criticism you sometimes hear is this idea that, well, it's all very well, but are you not just transferring emissions from the car to the power plant? So we'll have a little look at, if you like, the cleanliness of electricity. And on cleanliness, I'm going to be looking specifically at carbon dioxide emissions here. Clearly, one of the drivers for electric vehicles is also local emissions, if you like, things like nitrogen dioxide and smog and so on. That's not something I'm going to be covering here because that doesn't really connect specifically with the power industry to the same extent. So what I'm hoping you'll leave at the end of this webinar is an idea that these are linked. They're not separate issues. This idea of how many power stations we need is linked with the local constraints on accessing electricity, however it's generated, and also that the cleanliness of electricity is also going to be linked with local constraints and also the amount we need. And in particular, it's going to be linked by the fact that a combination of these factors are going to determine how we manage charging and the need for managed charging. So that's what we'll cover. I'm not going to go into lots of detail in any of the sections. That would take forever, and also we've got a course on it. But I do want to set the framework, set the background for this. There's lots of things happening. There are lots of projects, pilot projects, examples, and so on. So hopefully what this will do is when you read about some of those projects or see more about them in future, it'll give you a good background, a good kind of fundamental basis on which to think about the issues they're trying to address and why they're trying to address them. Okay, so let's start with additional demand for electricity. So on a macro level, if you like, a kind of system level. And here's a very simple calculation by which we can do that. We'll put some numbers into it on the next slide and see what actual figures we come up with. But here's my kind of simple calculation. So obviously it's going to depend on the number of cars we have. It's going to depend on how far they drive. So if we're looking at this on an annual basis, for example, how much electricity do we need every year? How many EVs, how far do they drive, and how efficient are they? So how many kilowatt hours of electricity do they need to drive a certain distance? And if we multiply those three things together, we're obviously going to get a total amount of electricity that those cars need. In terms of what we have to generate, it's going to be a bit more than that because we're going to lose some electricity between the power plants and it reaching the car. So we also need to think a little bit about grid losses. And so that's going to give us a number at the end of this, which is saying, okay, this is how much extra electricity we need to generate to be able to charge that number of cars driving that distance with that kind of efficiency. For some reason my mouse is going a bit funny. Okay, so a key thing about any of these calculations, whether I've done it here or whether you read about other calculations done by other people, is that these are variables. So that's a key thing. And what I want you to take away from this is some of the fundamental variables involved and some of the principles involved, not a specific answer or a specific number that I come up with. Clearly the number of EVs will vary from market to market. In particular, a key issue for the power sector is timescale. So how quickly are those electric vehicles going to grow? And so that's going to depend on various things. It's going to depend on policy. It's going to depend on what happens to the cost of electric vehicles, and it's going to depend on what consumers think of them compared to the alternatives, how well they perform, image, if you like, and all that's going to come into this rate of growth. Because we're not talking about replacing every vehicle tomorrow, we're talking about it happening over a time frame, and so that gives us some time to plan for whatever our required electricity generation at the end is going to be. Usage of EVs is going to be a key one. We can obviously look at how far the average car drives currently, but again, there's going to be various external factors that will affect that. Things like car sharing, autonomous vehicles. There's quite a lot of debate around the price of oil, which will affect the price of fuel, the price of electricity, which will affect obviously people's view of how often they want to charge. And there'll be various policy aspects around that, as I say, cost aspects, and also whether people need to drive. Alternatives might include things like public transport and so on. So again, we're already introducing the fact that this additional demand for electricity is not simply a question of looking at cars now and looking at the electricity system now. It's also about looking at the future and some trends that are external to particularly the electricity industry around mobility and how they're going to affect some of the assumptions we make. So if someone shows you a number like I'm going to on the next slide, a key thing to do is to immediately start questioning that number. What assumptions have gone into it, and in particular, how quickly can those numbers change and how much might they change based on the kind of other external factors that are involved. And then obviously there's technology improvements. So if we've got an assumption on efficiency for these vehicles, then the assumption going forwards, I think it's fair to say, is that the efficiency will improve, but how quickly will it improve? And also, as we'll see when I stick some numbers into the next slide, we've got to be a bit careful about whether we're assuming, if you like, published efficiency figures or real efficiency figures. We've had that whole issue, certainly in the conventional fuel market. So I'm actually going to be a bit pessimistic in the numbers I put in on the next slide. But again, that's going to matter. How people drive these things will impact how efficiently they're used. So manufacturers' figures and what we need to provide from the electricity system can be two very different things. So that's the key thing. It's a very simple calculation. It's very straightforward. It's going to give us, kind of spit out a number on how much electricity we need, but there's quite a few variables that you can apply to that calculation. There's quite a few uncertainties and quite a few things that you could change, but it's still useful. It's going to give us still a useful basis on which to start thinking about all this. And then the final point to make is that this is going to give us the required electricity generation for a certain number of EVs in the system, but the system is also providing lots of other electricity. And again, I'll just briefly illustrate how that matters. It's going to, is that growing? If you're in a market where you've got to supply not just growing EV demand for electricity, but also growing background demand for electricity, that's going to be a lot more challenging than in a market where your electricity demand from other sources may even be dropping. What you could find is that if efficiency and so on and dropping demand elsewhere in the electricity market isn't being offset by the growth in electricity demand, actually you can you can cope certainly for the foreseeable future with generating capacity that you've already got. So there we go. As we go through this, I guess it's worth me declaring a hand, particularly when we think about things like technology. I'm a technology optimist. In my early part of career, I spent quite a lot of my time analysing and tracking the mobile phone sector. So whenever people look at technology today and say, oh, you will never be able to do that, I'm always a bit sceptical of technology progress barriers. So that's, I guess it's worth declaring a bit of if you like, bias on that front. But what we're hopefully going to talk about here is some fundamental figures. So technology will come into it, but it certainly won't change some of the macro numbers. Okay, so let's stick some numbers into this kind of simple calculation. I've run numbers based on the UK because that's where I am, but bear in mind, and the same for some of the following slides, but bear in mind if you're not from the UK, the focus here is really on the type of calculation we're running through and the kind of variables that fall into it. You can certainly run the numbers for any other market, and if you do, actually I'd be fascinated to know what outcomes you come up with. So the UK at the moment, we have about 31 million cars, light vehicles, automobiles, whatever your favourite term is, on the road. And so in this calculation, I'm going to work on the basis that a third of those are going to be replaced by electric vehicles, so 10 million electric vehicles. On average in the UK, we drive about 12,500 kilometres every year in a car, in a private car. Well, not a private car, all cars, private and fleet. Fleet will drive slightly further than a private car, but that's the average of the whole thing. Interestingly, that's actually been falling, so that's another falls into that issue of variables. Obviously 10 million EVs is in the future. I'm going to actually stick in my calculation with today's average mileage, average kilometerage, but bear in mind that's been falling. Perhaps in future I should be assuming it will carry on falling. But let's be, if you like, pessimistic. Let's come up with a scenario where we carry on driving as much as we do today. So that's our number of vehicles, how far they drive every year, and then we need an efficiency measure. Again, I'm being a bit pessimistic, you could argue here, particularly if 10 million EVs is quite a long way in the future. I'm going to use an efficiency of 20 kilowatt hours being required to drive every 100 kilometers. If you look at the Nissan Leaf, for example, the new one, if you go onto Nissan's website and look at the range and the size of battery that they're talking about, their number is about 14 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers. If you go onto the US government EPA website, they have a figure of about 18 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers. 20 is more like a kind of big thing, like a Tesla. But anyway, I'm going to stick with that on the basis that you're never going to achieve the manufacturer's stated figures. If this is going to go mainstream drivers are often not too fussed about being very efficient. They tend to put their foot down and not go for eco mileage necessarily. So I'm going to stick with 20 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers. Again, given my technology optimism, you could say, well, actually, by the time we've got 10 million EVs, that would be a pretty poor efficiency measure. And I'd agree with you, but I want to make it difficult. Multiply those together, and I'm coming up with a number of 25 billion kilowatt hours of electricity needed every year. If you've got 8% grid losses, which is currently what a realistic number here in the UK, what that actually means is from power plants in the grid, you're going to need about 27,000 gigawatt hours of electricity every year. And that sounds like a big number. It is a big number. But actually, if you compare it to total UK electricity supply, it's about an 8% increase. So I've read lots of stuff saying how we'll need kind of double or triple the amount of power stations we have now and so on. Lots of apocalyptic figures about how much extra generation we need. 8% is not an enormous number. And I've done that with a very simple calculation. You can go elsewhere, you can go to National Grid here in the UK. There's a whole bunch of other consultants who've run much more complicated scenarios and models. And you'll see similar kinds of numbers, not just in the UK, but elsewhere. I've seen anywhere from depending on the timescale, obviously, people are talking about, and hence the penetration of EVs, but numbers of anywhere from 5 to 20% increases in electricity to accommodate big fleets of electric vehicles. So it's a lot. It's not an insignificant amount, but it's not an enormous amount. We're not talking about doubling our electricity supply, for example. Okay, now, again, there's a few other things we could maybe put into here. Grid losses, I only mentioned very briefly there. One future scenario, obviously, with electric vehicles is that more of the charging for them is based on distributed generation. So you have your PV panels on your roof, you maybe put them into a battery and then charge your vehicle from there. There may be other efficiencies within the grid. Is that going to fall? Possibly it would. Certainly if you've got more home charging, then you've not got that loss between generation and an actual consumption within the vehicle. But anyway, let's again work on that basis. Okay, so what does that mean? What does that look like in the context of supply here, 8% increase? This is, if you look at government data, this is numbers for the last 20 years of electricity supply in terawatt hours. So the 390 at the top here is 390,000 gigawatt hours here in the UK. And so here we are, actually 2016 was the last full set of figures that that they published. But if I add my 10 million EVs onto that, my 27 gigawatt at 27,000 gigawatt hours, 27 terawatt hours, it's back up to here. Now, in the context of what's been happening to UK electricity, we've actually been using less electricity over particularly the last 10 years. And so even if tomorrow I suddenly had 10 million electric vehicles on a macro level, the increase in electricity there would be lower than the amount that our consumption from other sources has dropped in the last 12, 13 years. Now, again, it would be perhaps a brave assumption to say that that reduction in electricity here in the UK, electricity use here in the UK is going to carry on at the same rate. But it does make the point that the background noise, if you like, the background scenario does matter. So if we're talking about how much extra infrastructure, be that grid capacity, be that power generating, energy generating capacity we need, you can't just look at EVs in isolation. You have to look at EVs in the context of what else is going on. Again, if I was to run this scenario for a country where that chart, instead of going down, was shooting up, and then I added another bit on top to accommodate electric vehicles, then that's a very different scenario. That's a much more challenging situation to work with. But in a market like this one, and the same will be true of other markets as well, or even if it was flat, it's a significant increase in energy that we need every year, but it's not necessarily crippling. But that's energy over the year. That's total aggregated energy on an annual basis. And obviously cars don't charge smoothly over the year. So what we're interested in is not the total amount of energy we need. We're particularly interested in when that energy is demanded. We're interested in power rather than energy. We want to look at megawatts and gigawatts rather than gigawatt hours and megawatt hours. Okay, so let's start to do that. Now, looks a bit complicated to begin with. And basically what I've done here is I've picked out a week of real electricity demand, which is the blue shaded areas on these three charts. And it was a week earlier this year, in the start of January. And so what we've got is each of these are days. You can see overnight demand is quite low. It rises during the day. In the UK, we have a peak in the early evening when everyone gets home from work and sticks the kettle on and sticks the lights on and whatever else. So that's the kind of pattern of demand. And then what I've done is I've superimposed onto that real demand a situation where we've got our 10 million electric vehicles. And what we can do is we can look at our total aggregate demand over the year. I can divide it by 365. So I'm going to make a very simple assumption here that that demand is spread evenly, that you don't have more on a Thursday than a Wednesday or whatever. Again, if we were going to go into a lot more detail, we'd have to think about more granular detail. But just to give a sense of some of the challenges, let's assume that that total yearly demand is spread evenly each day, and that comes up with this kind of number. So what we need is each day, our 10 million extra vehicles on the assumptions we made in terms of efficiency and mileage are going to require about 74 gigawatt hours, 74,000 megawatt hours per day to charge all those cars. And what I've done here is I've then chosen 3 different scenarios for how you could charge them. In blue, I've got what I've called a flat charging scenario, and so the scale up here now is megawatts. Okay, so we've got a number of megawatts at the side, and then we've got hours of the day along the bottom. And so my blue flat scenario is just saying that by some miraculous coincidence, the demand for charging these cars is spread completely evenly and completely uniformly through the day. And so to get our 74,500 megawatt hours, we would divide that by 24, and we end up with whatever that is, about 3 and a bit thousand megawatts on a continuous basis. So that's one scenario, and then I've got a couple of others. I've got what I've called an unmanaged scenario in red. Now this actually is what you would see currently we've got very few electric cars on the road, but the ones that we have, if you look at certainly on the consumer-owned ones, people tend to come home from work. They get home from work sometime around kind of 5, 6, 7 o'clock. They plug it in, put it on charge. And so what that produces is a spike in demand, and it produces a spike in demand at exactly the same time as we have our peak demand here in the UK. So that's my red scenario. Everyone comes in, plugs in, they charge the car, and actually if you went back to the previous slide, on average this 74,500 megawatt hours per day actually works out at only about 7.5 kilowatt hours per car per day, because the mileage on average is not that high. And so if you had a 7 kilowatt charger, for example, that's just over an hour. So it's not that every single car is going to take all night to charge, because people simply don't use that much energy. They don't travel that mileage. And so actually what we'll end up with is that most of these cars are arriving home still with a big chunk of charge in the battery, and so they're not charging all night, but there'll be a spike where they fill up and then it will decrease again. And some might carry on charging a bit further overnight, but certainly by the time people are going to work at 5 or 6 o'clock in the morning, they're all charged up. You might have a few during the day. So that's another scenario. That's this unmanaged scenario. In that unmanaged scenario, we end up with this rather ridiculous looking chart here. If you multiply, so basically we're saying if every single one of these 10 million cars happened to do that unmanaged scenario, we're adding enormous amounts to our electricity need. We're not adding an enormous amount in terms of aggregate energy. We said that was about 8%, but our peak demand is suddenly going bananas. It's way up here. In fact, we've added about 16 gigawatts to it. And that's where you get into this argument that, oh, we'll need however many nuclear power plants, or we'll need vast amounts of infrastructure to cope with this. And if that scenario were ever to happen, then you could argue, well, yes, that's true. The fact is there are reasons why you wouldn't get that. You'll always have a bit more of a spread of charging during the day. But it does make the point, if you take a worst case scenario, it does make the point that we can't have a mass market of EVs if we're just going to have completely unmanaged charging. We're going to have charging which moves the levels of demand away from the peak as much as we can. And so I've also come up with a scenario which is in green, where we still allow a little bit of growth in charge as people plug in, but actually most of it is delayed then till later on in the evening, 11 o'clock onwards, and in the early hours of the morning, and then maybe a little bit during the day if the sun's out and there's lots of PV in the system. So again, we could draw lots of different curves. The point about each of these curves is that the area underneath them is exactly the same. So every one of these is delivering our 74,500 megawatt hours per day of electricity. It's just delivering it at different rates at different times during the day. And obviously the effect is quite dramatic if we go from our slightly ridiculous unmanaged situation to this nice managed situation where we've managed to shift it all till overnight. We've delivered exactly the same amount of energy. We've charged all those cars up perfectly well, but now we've only added 1.5 gigawatts of peak demand to our system, which in the grand scheme of things is pretty trivial. Bear in mind that the electricity system has a capacity margin anyway. We don't plan our system just for peak demand. We plan it for peak demand plus a reasonable percentage above that. So if we can manage charging, we can have a very dramatic impact on how much peak power we need, and it's much easier to accommodate the total aggregate amount of energy that we need. So it kind of makes the point that we're going to have managed charging. The idea that we can just let people plug in as soon as they get home from work, switch the charger on and expect to have their car fully charged by 9 o'clock on a scale of tens of millions is kind of slightly bonkers. It's not going to happen. As I say, there's reasons why, just from a natural point of view, not everyone is going to behave like that, so it would be spread out anyway. But also from a cost point of view, it would make no sense at all to allow very large increases in demand for very small periods of time and building capacity to match that. So from a macro point of view, that's kind of the notion behind having managed charging. But of course, managed charging is not just about the macro system. It's not just about the whole electricity system. So if we skip forward a little bit, the other bottleneck we have is our local distribution network. So the last bit of the wire that's going to get from the substation to your house and provide the capacity and provide the electricity to charge your car at home. Again, with the caveat that not all cars will charge at home. So this slide is just kind of summarizing the issue with local capacity constraints. If you look at average electricity load, electricity demand, electricity power from a reasonably above average, actually, UK home, it actually averages out during a January week, somewhere between 0.5 and a peak of 1.5 kilowatts. It's actually not that high. It's surprisingly low when people look at, for example, some of these individual devices. But the reason that average is low is that these individual devices, like a kettle, for example, or an electric shower, are not on for very long. They might have a very high power demand, but they're used for a very short period of time. So if you've got 100 houses in a street, basically the way the system is designed is not so that it can support everyone having a kettle on at the same time. It uses what's called demand diversity to plan that system. It's based on the fact that you'll have spikes in load from individual homes, but when you look at them from a kind of substation point of view and a distribution network feeder point of view, actually the average will be much lower. And so that's why, as for an example network feeder, for example, for 100 homes might only have a capacity of 200 kilowatts. And by capacity, I mean before you start having issues with voltage problems and thermal effects and so on. So if you divide 200 by 100, that means that you're assuming each home can go up to about 2 kilowatts. So it's not, if we designed our distribution network feeder so that everyone could have a shower at the same time, we'd end up with it would be a bit like that previous chart. It'd be like designing our electricity system so that for an hour in the evening we allowed an extra 20 gigawatts of power demand. You'd be over designing everything. There's just a natural statistical averaging that happens when you start to put together small but high peaks. Now, one of the arguments, one of the challenges with EVs is that you have quite a high demand, and the kind of standard home charger now is quite rapidly becoming kind of 7 kilowatts, I would say, in the UK, but potentially for quite long periods of time. It could be a few hours. If a car arrives home with very low charge, it could be most of the night. And so that the danger there is that you start to reduce some of that demand diversity. So that's the challenge on the local distribution system. In some ways, it's a kind of microcosm of the challenge we had earlier. We want to design a system not for a kind of unlikely scenario where we've got lots and lots of high power things all plugged in at the same time. But one of the challenges with EVs is the probabilities potentially of things being plugged in at the same time rise because they're plugged in for longer periods of time. In practice, where this becomes an issue is it introduces something called clustering, which is where this is most likely to be a problem is on particular streets, because you'll find that particular streets will tend to have clusters of EVs. Again, our purchasing of electric vehicles is not going to be perfectly distributed around the whole distribution network. If you want to get into kind of social issues, you could argue that clustering is likely, for example, in wealthier neighbourhoods where you'll have concentrations of EV buyers. Those neighbourhoods may also have more high-load electrical devices in the home anyway. So certainly what you find with the distribution network, the challenge is is localised. It's not a macro challenge. It's not every distribution feeder everywhere. It's going to be concentrated in a few areas where you have these clusters of electric vehicles. So our average for the country might be a third, but there might be one street where everyone has one. So that's kind of the challenge, and the challenge to overcome is, again, how do you fit multiple EVs within this distribution network feeder capacity limit? So that's the challenge. An actual home capacity is pretty high. So in this scenario, I mean, I could have the kettle on, the oven on, and my EV charging, and in most cases I'm going to have enough capacity in my home not to trip the fuse. If I then jump in the shower, I might have a problem. But again, how likely is that? You might that you've got your meal going, you jump in the shower while you make a cup of tea, and you've got your car charging in the background. I mean, but that's more of a problem for your home than it is for our power system as a whole, if you like. Okay, so let's think about, let's illustrate that again with some charts. So the top one here, that's just illustrating this issue about that's the home view, if you like. If I've got a house where my capacity goes up to about 15 kilowatts, and my average domestic load, so this is January, and this chart, the blue here, is from some helpful UK government figures that were brought out. I think last year they did quite a detailed survey on electricity usage in different households in the UK. So this is actually a slightly above average sized home in the UK, and this was for January. So as you can see, the peak on an average basis, the peak is about 1.5 kilowatts. That scale should actually be watts rather than kilowatts. So 1,000 is not 1,000 kilowatts, it's 1,000 watts. And then I've added on that what I've called a group of EV owners that I call worriers. I'm defining a worrier as someone that probably commutes a bit further than normal. So their daily mileage is 100 kilometres. So their annual mileage is going to be more than 12,500. They've got a reasonably big car. Again, I'm going to stick to my 20 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometre efficiency. So when they arrive home, they're going to have 50% state of charge. We're going to have 50% of the capacity of that battery left on an average day. If they turn up at 7 o'clock, plug in, and they've got one of these faster chargers, say it charges on an average of 5 kilowatts, because what you'll find is that chargers don't charge at a uniform rate, particularly when they get towards fully charged, the charge rate drops quite substantially. But if on average they were charging at 5 kilowatts, they'll have filled their car up again by 11 p.m. And so that's what they want. They want to be fully charged in a few hours, 4 hours in this case, from when they get home. Okay. Now, from a home point of view, that's not a big deal. If I add that extra load, basically I'm adding 5 kilowatts above the domestic load, I'm still well within my household limit. I can still jump in the shower or whatever, or watch the telly during this period. The issue becomes when you add that up, and again, this is where we get into our distribution feeder view. If I have 5 households, so 5 households with a worrier in it, and I up to a total of 100. So this 100 households is basically multiplying this blue by 100 to get a bigger curve, and then I'm adding 5 of these EV owner households on top. Now I'm fine. I'm still fine in that case because my feeder limit we said was 200 kilowatts. Again, watts, not kilowatts here. Trouble is, if we now have 20 households, then we start to go above our limit. So again, that's just making that point. It's from the distribution network point of view, the substation point of view. What it's seeing is the aggregated amount of power drawn by both these 100 households and now 20 of these households also having EVs. And if these EV owners all come and plug in an unmanaged fashion, then that's where you start to have issues. Okay, so what can we do about it? So if we start, this is the same chart again as we had on the previous slide. So that's our unmanaged situation. Now, one solution to the problem would be that when we reach our 200 kilowatt limit, we just curtail this. We just are able to stop those chargers from drawing so much charge. We don't turn them off necessarily, but we reduce the amount of power they're able to draw. So we could do curtailment. What would happen is that if you do the calculations, you end up with those cars are now only achieving about 76% of their charge by 11 o'clock, which is not disastrous actually. Those vehicles can still go 150 kilometers the next day, which is more than their 100 kilometer commute. But it's not necessarily going to be something that consumers are very delighted with. They plugged in expecting to have 100% charge the next morning. They get in their car and it's only 76% charge. But curtailment would be one option if you didn't want to start going and increasing this limit by upgrading substations, wires, and so on. Okay, but there are other ways of doing this. This is our managed situation. So this is saying, well, actually, if we spread out that load, if we reduce the charge rate now to an average of 2 kilowatts, we can charge all those 20 cars. They'll all be charged up by 5 a.m., ready for people to drive off to work again. They'll all be 100% charged. So that's managed charging. That's simply one thing we can do is simply spread out how we charge those cars. And bear in mind that by 2 kilowatts, it doesn't necessarily mean that every one of those 20 cars charges at 2 kilowatts. It just means that the average of those 20 at any point is 2 kilowatts. You could charge some of them fully and some of them could be delayed charging till later on. However you do it, you're managing it so that from the substation point of view, it looks like a lower charge rate overall for those cars. So that's another way of doing it. And there's plenty of work being done to come up with systems to do that management, do that control of charging. But it's not the only way. The other alternative, if people are really determined to plug in, have their car charged as quickly as possible, is to introduce storage. And so if you do the calculations, what we're doing here is we've got storage, and in fact I've got 15 households with Tesla Powerwalls. Again, other brands are available, but I just picked that as it's a popular one. And so the capacity of the storage you get with those 15 Powerwalls is such that I can fill them up overnight when demand is low, so this is charging, and then I can discharge them at peak time when everyone's suddenly plugging their EV into the system. And if you add on charging and take off discharging from the overall load, you get this blue curve. So this is now the load that the substation is seeing, and it's managing to, I picked the numbers obviously, so it just about stays below our 200 kilowatt limit. So from the car owner's point of view, your car, the behavior is exactly the same. Your cars are all charged by 11 p.m., 100%. But from the substation point of view, what's happening is that some of that peak demand is coming out of storage rather than being delivered from the grid. So that keeps us below our limit. So that looks good. There's a couple of things to bear in mind here. That this is an aggregate street view. Those Powerwalls don't actually have to be in the same households as the electric vehicles, although you could argue that perhaps they should be. Maybe you should incentivize or penalize worriers who insist on having unmanaged charging to invest in those batteries, because otherwise why should everyone else in the street or everyone else in the neighborhood pay for upgrades to the grid system, or in fact everyone in the system as a whole pay for upgrades to the grid system if they're being caused by these one or two relatively small number of households that are demanding to have their car charged in a very small space of time. So there might be commercial mechanisms to make sure that storage is introduced into the system. Equally, given that we said those Powerwalls don't have to be in the same houses as the EVs, you could even have local trading whereby you could incentivize someone with a Powerwall to get paid by the person charging their EV on a local trading network. Again, you could start to get into things like blockchain and all the other technologies around producing little local commercial arrangements to do that. So there's various cunning things we can do. And then obviously it's also worth making the point that storage and EVs potentially fit quite nicely with distributed energy generation, in particular PV. So in the last example, it's the same as this one, except that instead of charging the battery from the grid overnight, we're charging it from a PV system, 4 kilowatt PV system on rooftops during the day. And in this case, again, 15 households with batteries, and also the same number of households with PV systems would achieve that. They could all be the same household, so it could be the same household has their EVs, their PV system and storage, or they could be the same numbers of households but spread around this street of 100 with some kind of trading arrangement between them. So there's various options by which you can achieve this issue of overcoming local capacity constraints. It can be simply about externally managing charging or encouraging people to manage their own charging via price incentives and so on. But there are other ways you can do it as well. You can, if behaviourally it proves quite tricky to get everyone to spread out their charging overnight. Maybe they've got young kids and they're worried about that issue at midnight where they need the car to be charged so they can rush off to A&E. Things like storage and things like distributed generation and storage can start to alleviate some of those issues as well. There are other solutions, and in practice, I would suggest we're going to find is a combination of these different solutions to solve these kind of problems. Okay. Now that last one also raises the issue about carbon, which I mentioned at the start, about emissions. How clean is electricity? Now, again, these are all interrelated. In particular, the cleanliness, if you like, and by cleanliness, I'm talking about low carbon electricity here. The cleanliness of that electricity is related to time, and the reason for that is that at different times of day you have different levels of demand, and so for different levels of demand you use a different mix of supply, and a different mix of supply means a different level of emission. So again, one of the issues I keep seeing is when people are looking at, well, how carbon intensive is it going to be to charge electric cars, they kind of look at an average carbon intensity for a system. Actually, when you charge those cars, which is related to things like grid capacity constraints and the overall, as well as the overall macro demand in the system, it's going to have a big impact on how cleanly you charge those cars. So that's the supply mix, and then also the other thing that's going to affect that from a customer's point of view is how much it costs. So, for example, having a different supply mix will change the wholesale cost of electricity at different times of day. One of the issues is that isn't passed on at the moment to customers. We'll come back to that. But if it were, then you could expect customers to also have a bit of a feedback loop here. If it was more expensive for them to charge a car at a certain time, then they probably wouldn't. So they would change the time at which they charge the cars. If that happens on a large basis, so if you've now got 10 million customers, or in future 30 million customers, who are for whom charging their car is a big chunk of their electricity use, then that will feed back into changing the demand profile. And if the demand profile changes, then the supply mix changes, and that all feeds into the carbon mix. So it's important, I think, to, when you think about the power system and you think about levels of demand, amounts of what generators you need, and things like managed charging and the effect that might have on time shifting loads, it's all tied in then with what supply of electricity will meet those loads, and hence what the carbon mix is going to be. These aren't separate issues, is the point I think is important to make. And again, just to hammer home that point, here is the electricity mix here in the UK for the week of starting the 8th of February, so a couple of weeks ago now. We've got nuclear, which kind of chunters along fairly base rate at the bottom, this green. Most of the flexibility within the UK system comes from gas, here in the light blue at the top, obviously fossil related. In the winter we still have some coal in the sort of grey-brown colour here, particularly at peak times. And then in the middle we've got a mix of various things, interconnectors, but also we've got wind onshore and offshore in the red, and we've got, during the middle of the day, some yellow solar popping out. For the UK, and that particular week in February was quite sunny on some days, so you've got a reasonable blob of yellow solar in there. And what that means is, if you go to the chart below, same week, the carbon intensity, so in other words, how much carbon dioxide is emitted for every kilowatt hour of electricity generated, that varies, and it varies quite substantially. It varies all the way from about 150 grams of CO2 for every kilowatt hour, all the way up to more than 350. So there's quite a big variation. Generally speaking, you'll find that worse carbon, so if you like dirtier electricity, coincides with peak demand, because we're burning more fossil gas, and we tend to still burn some fossil coal in the winter. Minimum carbon intensity coincides with the middle of the night, when demand is very low, so there's a lot less gas and a lot less coal. If you've also got low demand and you've got, for example here, quite high amounts of wind generation, then that will also have an impact. So the amount of renewable generation at a particular point in time will matter. There can be occasions where you have low carbon intensity even at times of high demand. So in this case, the reason for that is we had both high wind and a big chunk of solar, and that again squeezed out coal and gas from the mix. So if we're going to talk about how clean is it going to be to charge these cars, you've got to think about time. We can't just sort of we can't just say an average or just pick the highest number. It does make the point that if we'll charge at peak times, we might be picking the highest number. So again, that purely from a sustainability, a kind of environmental point of view, that's another reason to have managed charging and to not charge at peak time. It's not just about can we meet demand, it's also about, if we do that, certainly with the UK electricity mix, it'll be a dirtier way to do it. If we can charge overnight and or we can charge at times when we have lots of solar or wind generation, then we'll have a lower amount of carbon being emitted as well. So again, it introduces another variable potentially into this whole idea of managed charging. It'll be about cost. It'll be about avoiding peak times from the grid perspective, because that will introduce extra cost. But also for consumers, you can encourage them to shift by making them aware of the carbon intensity that's of the system at any point in time, and that will tend to shift them away from peak times anyway, if that's something that drives them. Again, this will be specific to different countries. I would say in many cases, peak demand will tend to be more carbon intensive because it'll tend to introduce more fossil burning. You can envisage there could be situations where that's different. So if you're in a very sunny country driven by air conditioning load, where you've got solar providing peak load, and maybe with a bit of storage to time shift that slightly, you could find a situation where actually you have very low carbon intensity because you've got lots of sunshine at peak times. And so there you might have a bit of a conflict between when a time you want to avoid because that's the highest other demand, and so you've got the biggest capacity crunch, and also having in that situation the lowest carbon intensity. So it's possible to come up with scenarios where the two don't entirely work in sync. So again, these kind of calculations and these kind of considerations are going to be quite country specific. It's worth bearing that in mind. Again, seasonal variations as well. Well, I'm not going to dwell on that one. It varies. It will vary depending whether you're charging in winter or summer, but for most people that's not really an issue. But the bottom one, again, as well as an annual trend of reducing overall electricity demand in this country, we've also got a trend of reducing carbon intensity. So again, we could bear that in mind when we're thinking about the future. We're not going to have 10 million cars any day now, EVs on the road. By the time we do, it'll be interesting to know what this level of carbon intensity is going to be. And again, we can do a very simple calculation, and we can compare, for example, EVs with, and I've chosen petrol cars here on the basis that in many places diesel seems to be a bit of a dying breed. In actual fact, as we'll see, the calculations are not going to be wildly dissimilar. The thing that will change is the efficiency, the fuel economy that you assume. And the calculation here is from an EV side. Again, we've got our efficiency. How many kilowatt hours do we need to move a kilometre? How many kilometres are we going? And then the other thing we need to work out emissions is how many grams of CO2 do we emit for every kilowatt hour that we need, which was the previous slides, that sort of carbon intensity of our electricity generation. And we can compare that with our petrol cars, where we have a fuel economy in miles per gallon or litres per kilometre. I've tried to metricise all the units here. Again, multiplied by how many kilometres we drive, and in this case, multiplied by how many grams of CO2 are emitted for every litre of petrol that we burn. And so we can compare the two together. If I stick with my 12,500 kilometre a year assumption for both of these, then these are the numbers you come up with. Again, I've been slightly pessimistic, I'd argue, on my EV efficiency, if we're talking future. 150 to 300, that was kind of the range currently that we've seen in January here in the UK. Again, might expect that to go down in future. Multiply that all together, and we end up with these kind of numbers. Depending on the carbon intensity at the time, it can be anywhere between 410 and 800, so 400 and 800 kilograms of CO2 being emitted by every vehicle every year. So in this case, an EV not being emitted by the vehicle, but being emitted, if you like, by the power station on the vehicle's behalf. And so this 820 would be picking the dirtiest generation mix. So that's our kind of peak time charging. If we compare that with petrol, in terms of fuel economy, I picked numbers 3 to 7 litres per 100 kilometres. Now, for units that might be a bit more familiar, if you're in the UK, 3 litres per 100 kilometre is about 94 miles per gallon. Now, good luck if you're getting that in your car, but there are companies like Massey, for example, who would claim that I can't remember what it's called, they've got an engine coming out in a year or two's time, which they reckon will potentially start to reach that kind of level of efficiency for petrol in future. So if we give them the benefit of the doubt, we can look up how much carbon dioxide you get out of a litre of burning petrol, multiply them up, and we get these kind of numbers. So if we pick the best fuel economy for our petrol engines and compare it with our dirtiest generation mix for our not terribly efficient EV, we get about the same number. Beyond that, it's really hard, I would say, to make the case that EVs are anything but a lot better from a carbon dioxide point of view than petrol, even taking into account the emissions from the power plants. Now, again, before people start screaming at the screen, there are obviously some assumptions here. I'm only looking, for example, at what I'd call fuel-to-wheel efficiency. So fuel going into the power plant and getting to the car, from fuel going into the tank of the car and coming out as turning the wheels. We could certainly go further back, and you can have debates about the emissions from battery manufacturing versus oil refining versus mining and drilling and so on. There's also debates around resources like lithium and cobalt and so on. So don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that this is the final word in deciding whether EVs are cleaner or not than petrol. I'm simply looking from a carbon emissions point of view, from kind of a fuel to wheel basis, if you like. You'd have to have, if you start assuming all your generation is from coal, which would be about 900 to 1,000 grams per CO2, then you can start to have arguments that, well, actually, you're just transferring emissions to the power plant. But if you've got a system where you've got a decent percentage of renewables in there, or even a decent percentage of nuclear in there, because that's low carbon, then actually it's very difficult to come up with any realistic scenario whereby they're not less carbon emitting than your petrol vehicles. And again, the point here is not so much this calculation per se, but it's that the input into this calculation, particularly on this side, depends on time, and it depends on the time of day that you're charging, which ties in with managed charging. And so all these things, the idea of EV clustering, local distribution feeder capacity, national electricity mix, and carbon emissions, they're not separate issues. They're all linked together, and there are feedback loops between all of them. Okay, so I think pretty much said what I wanted to say. Again, some of the charts I showed you on things like distribution feeder networks and so on, I mean, they're just snapshots of a much more detailed model where you can model different types of mixes of car owner. It doesn't just have to be worriers. You can have people that do charge overnight or at different times of day and do that in a lot more detail. You can explore storage and PV in a bit more detail. And so I can, if you choose to come on one of the courses, that's the kind of thing that we'll go into a lot more detail into, as well as looking at some of the case studies and examples of what's happening in the real world. Because again, I'm sort of giving you some theoretical framework to that and some calculations into that. There's plenty of real world activity and real world trials going on to show what's happening here. Issues tend to be around having shown that managed charging is not just desirable, I would say essential, both from a street to a country level. The priority then is, well, how do you implement it? How do you go about actually encouraging people either to manage their own charging by changing their behaviour, or impose, if you like, external control of charges onto them. And so that's going to be things like tariffs. At the moment, as we said, the price that customers pay for electricity doesn't reflect the price it costs to generate in most places. So things like time of use tariffs are going to be hugely important. Storage to allow time shifting of electricity, both low carbon renewable electricity, but also taking advantage of these new tariffs. Again, those two things go together. It's much easier to benefit from time of use tariffs if you can do your own time shifting as well. But then lots of issues around the controls for managed charging and standardization, interoperability. Will it work with every different car? The communications needed, consumer behavior, how will they buy in? What will incentivize them to do it? Most of these programs at the moment, the pilots have opt-out systems. So how many people will choose to opt out rather than allow the system to, if you like, take over the management of that charging? So there's lots of issues that we could go further with more time. We could explore in a bit more detail. Again, just to lay my cards on the table, I'm an optimist. I don't think any of these are insurmountable problems. And in fact, I would say what this opens up is a whole bunch of business opportunities. It opens up lots of scope for innovation. It opens up lots of scope for new products and services and tariff regimes and commercial offerings and so on that help consumers to, in a world with millions of EVs, it helps them to charge their cars in a way that has the least impact, the least economic, and also fits in that charging with things like low carbon electricity, distributed generation, energy storage, and so on. So to my mind, it's an exciting world. Hopefully I've kind of piqued your interest in the whole thing. Obviously I have to plug the course, so if you're interested in in taking this further, by all means contact Green Power or myself to find out more about the extra detail we go into in the course. If you've got any questions, then by all means contact me as well. And I'm also always delighted to hear about any insights and experiences that people have from other countries or data that they've got from other countries. I'm more than happy to run some of those models with new data. So I think for there we've sort of filled our hour. I'll pack up for the moment and hand over to Jamie and see if there's any questions that you want me to have a go answering.